This is the second video for week 6 in which we learn about mutations in cancer. Now, if you have someone close to you or if you yourself has or have had cancer, this may be a difficult topic. And if that's the case, take it slow, take the time you need, move forward when you're ready. And also this chapter doesn't really relate very well with GMOs, but it is very useful information and you need it for your assignment, so stick it out. In this chapter, we're learning more about mutations and some of the ways that they occur. We're going to look at how cancer develops and why, unfortunately, childhood cancers exist and how they develop. So let's start with this. What exactly is cancer? Cancer is defined very simply as uncontrolled cell division. That's just what it is. Cancer can be caused by mutations. These can be mutations that you inherit from your parents or your grandparents or whoever. You can acquire mutations in your lifetime. And also there are certain infections that are associated with cancer. Notably, cervical cancer is associated with HPV. This is the human papilloma virus. It's something like 80% of cervical cancers were caused by HPV. Okay, so this virus, human papilloma virus, it can only replicate in a cell that is going through S phase, if you remember from last video. And most of the time, cells aren't in S phase, they're in the G phase, G1. So papillomavirus has a molecular mechanism, a molecular signal that forces the cell to enter the S phase, replicate its DNA, and in the process replicate the virus's DNA as well to further its infection. So what that is the cell moving into S phase. Once it does that, there's a cascade of events. It is going to divide. That's just the way it is. Once a cell enters S phase, it also goes on to G2 and into mitosis. So this is cell division that is not controlled by the cell. Instead, it's controlled by the virus. And as you may know, HPV is sexually transmitted. It is also everywhere. Warts are also caused by HPV, but it's a different strain. Don't worry. It's not the same that can infect genitals at all. And most people actually get a human papillomavirus at some point in their lives. Almost everybody does, but not all strains are cancer-causing. And it's only something like, this is not only, but 43% of women women with HPV contract a strain that's associated with cancer. That's a lot. This is a big deal. And because of this prevalence, many countries are pushing for mandatory vaccination of girls before they become sexually active. Mexico very recently passed a law stating all girls at the age of 9 will get vaccinated from HPV. In the US, it's not mandatory, but it is recommended. First dose at 11 to 12 years of age. Right now, as far as I know, there are 3 doses that you need to go to, but research is showing that 2 doses is effective, so they're trying to reduce the number of doses needed to encourage people to go and get fully vaccinated. My oldest daughter actually just got her HPV vaccine with her flu shot, either a week or 2 weeks ago, depending on when exactly you watch this video. So I'm proud of that. There's also a really strong push currently in the scientific community, the medical community at least, for at least recommended, maybe even required vaccinations for boys as well, because there are cancers that happen in boys as a result of HPV. Cancers in men usually by the time they're cancers. So vaccinate your kids. Okay, mutations, unfortunately, they don't make you a superhero or an X-Man, but what they are is a change in the nucleotide sequence of your DNA. So mutation is just a change. These can affect the structure, which therefore affects the function of proteins. And also remember that the molecules that are responsible for DNA replication and proofreading of DNA replication, getting rid of mutations, those are themselves proteins. The correct functioning of those proteins, therefore, requires an unmutated gene to code for them. If that gene is mutated, then say the proofreading protein is altered and not functioning correctly, then more mutations in other genes throughout the genome can occur. And there are also proteins, including those molecular mechanisms that HPV has that I was talking about, that induce the cell to divide. There are proteins that our own cells make that control the cell moving out of G1 into S phase and eventually throughout that cascade into mitosis. There are reasons to divide, of course, like we said, growth and wound healing and replacement of cells. But if those proteins are altered and overexpressed, perhaps, then you're moving into mitosis too often, or if the proteins responsible for preventing a cell from going into mitosis, then cancer can develop as these cells continuously divide uncontrolled. And that's kind of the theme of the rest of the slides. So the genes that code for cell division controlling proteins are sometimes called cancer genes because of the severe consequences, namely cancer, that can result because of their mutation. This first one, these proto-oncogenes, these are healthy, normal genes that activate the cell cycle, so they move a cell into S phase, into G2, and eventually into mitosis. And if those genes are affected, then you can get overexpression of these proteins. But as a side note, and an important one, it's not the coding sequence of the proto-oncogene that gets mutated, it's the regulatory sequence. So if you remember, there are a couple of pieces to a gene. On the DNA strand, you have a regulatory sequence that tells the RNA polymerase how much mRNA to make from this gene and when to do it. And then you have the coding sequence, which is all of the codons that code for the amino acids to make the protein. And then you also have a stop codon that tells it to stop right there. Those three pieces are what make up a gene. If a proto-oncogene is mutated in the regulatory sequence, then it can be overexpressed. You get more of these gene products, these proteins that induce S phase and eventually mitosis. And that could be a problem. At that point, we call it just an oncogene when it's mutated and results in cancer. There are also tumor suppressor genes that, through their normal functioning, help us with this. These tell the genes to do a couple different things. Some of them tell the cell to stay in the G1 phase and not divide, and some other genes can tell the cell to go into apoptosis. If that's not the best word you've ever heard, I don't know what to tell you also. But apoptosis is programmed cell death. So it's a protein from a gene that tells the cell there's something wrong, you need to kill yourself and save the whole organism. The picture on the right is what this looks like. So that's a cell in the process of apoptosis. It's lysing or breaking apart. And what that will do is it can't divide anymore to become cancer. So it's saving the whole organism. Kind of a neat little function of our bodies. So these mutations result in a new version of the gene. Remember, it's called an allele. And you really need to remember that word because this is the unit that we're going to use the word allele a lot. Also, remember that these mutations are not always harmful. You can have alleles that are perfectly safe, but because of the nature of this chapter, we're going to talk about the ones that are harmful. An example is this BRCA1 gene. When this becomes mutated, like this figure on the left is showing, it's associated with a higher risk of breast cancer. And there are two types of mutations. You can have somatic mutations. These are mutations in a cell in your body. That's what somatic means, is body. And that's any cell except your gametes. Gametes are sperm and egg cells. If a mutation happens in a gamete, it's called a germline mutation, and it's spread down to your children. And that's a big, big problem. Those are inherited mutations. Now, if you recall, our cells make some mistakes. It's less than about 1 mutation in a billion nucleotides. It's okay, not a huge problem. Those are just normal replication errors. But in a genome the size of a human's, 3 billion nucleotides, every time a cell divides, it can make some mutations. And you also have to consider all the cells in your body are dividing as you grow, as you heal a cut, or just things like replacing the skin that is sloughed off. These result in mutations. There's a really good chance that given a cell division, or a couple of them, there's going to be some mutations. Well, then if mutations cause cancer, and we're all carrying mutations, I guarantee it, that's why we don't all look exactly alike, why don't we all have cancer right now? Well, fortunately, our cells have several pathways for avoiding cancer. It's like a checks and balances system. So I talked about the proto-oncogenes and the tumor suppressor genes. And then there are some others too. But the point is, you have to accumulate a lot of mutations before you get cancer. And this is called the multi-hit model, where each hit is a mutation, just for the verbiage there. You have to really accumulate a lot to get cancer. So we've got mutations from normal errors during DNA replication. We all have some mutations that we've inherited from our ancestors. And then on top of that, there are environmental factors that can cause mutations, as if that wasn't enough. An environmental agent that causes a mutation, any mutation, a cancer-causing one or not, is called a mutagen. These can be totally harmless, or they can cause cancer. An example of a harmless mutagen, or I don't know if harmless is the word, but a non-cancerous mutagen is something, maybe affected height was mutated. Then maybe growth will be stunted, or it could even be accelerated and you're not an average height anymore. But you don't have cancer, so it's not so bad. But if the mutagen does cause cancer, then specifically we call it a carcinogen. You've all heard that word, I'm sure. So you can't do anything about mutations that occur from normal DNA replication mistakes. You can't do anything about mutations that you inherit, but you can limit your exposure to as many carcinogens or mutagens as possible. You can quit smoking. You can wear sunscreen. You can reduce your intake of alcohol, and yeah, even burnt food, charred food is a carcinogen. Some things you just can't avoid, so you do what you can. If you ever need a little boost in motivation to say quit smoking or not go out binge drinking with your friends, do a Google image search for tumor, but don't do it while you're eating. It was bad. This picture is the least offensive that I could find on the first page quickly. Tumors can be benign or malignant. Benign tumors are non-invasive. This means that they don't make new tumors. They're also non-cancerous, so they're not always a problem, but they can be pre-cancerous. So you should always have anything new on your body, a growth or a color change or anything like that. You should have those checked out by a doctor just in case. Malignant tumors are cancerous. These can spread to other tissues. This is called metastasis. So malignant tumors can metastasize. Say that 5 times fast. This is a really big problem because one tumor can create a bunch of other tumors. It's possible because once a cell becomes cancerous, it loses a lot of its specificity, its differentiation. So a skin cell performs a certain job, like I've mentioned, has all the genes that, say, a nerve cell has, but it only expresses genes specific to the function of a skin cell. But if that skin cell becomes cancerous through sun exposure or something, it changes. It's no longer just a skin cell, it's just a cancer cell, and its function changes. It can even dislodge from its tumor that it's growing on, and it can travel through the blood. It can land on, say, a liver, and it can begin to grow a new tumor there. Now, it's not skin cancer, it's liver cancer. But we only call it that because that's where we happen to find it. It doesn't care. It's just cancer. So, how do we get rid of cancer? How do we get rid of tumors? These are the three most common, but not the only ways. But I do want you guys to know the difference between these. Chemotherapy is brutal. It's the injection of chemicals that target and kill rapidly dividing cells. That's good because rapidly dividing cells are in tumors. You want to kill that tumor, but it's also bad in chemo patients tend to lose their hair because it just targets anything that's rapidly dividing. That includes the cells that are producing hair. So it kills those cells that are rapidly dividing to kill hair. And there's some other really bad issues. A patient who is pregnant can't receive chemotherapy because of the intense risk to her rapidly growing fetus. So it's kind of brutal that way. Radiation, whoa, is kind of neat. It's shown to the right here on an example with prostate cancer. Just a little drawing of what it looks like. Radiation usually uses beams of radiation, which is a mutagen, to try to further mutate the cancer cells. That sounds bad, right? But what it's hoping to do is to trigger that cell to induce apoptosis. Be like, hey, it's like something is wrong. You have to die. The cell, not the patient. So they accomplish this without causing more cancers by directing several low-intensity beams that are not strong enough by themselves to cause cancer and crossing them so that they all cross over at the same point on the tumor. Okay, but this stuff out here, all of this body tissue, isn't exposed to enough radiation to cause mutations. So that's the hope, is to just trigger the body to realize that there is a problem and to induce apoptosis. And then there's surgery. This just removes tumors, pretty classic. So this surgery does usually increase the risk of metastasis because it can physically dislodge cells that then get into the bloodstream. So it's usually followed up with another treatment, something like chemotherapy or at least further observation. And surgery is not possible with things like blood cancers, leukemia, because there's no solid tumor. There's nothing, no single thing to take out. Those are pretty brutal for that. Each of these methods have their pros and their cons. To summarize, cancer is defined simply as uncontrolled cell division. It's happening too much, and it causes tumors. Certain mutations can lead to cancer because they are affecting the proteins that regulate the cell cycle and either end up over replicating or failing to stop over replication. And then also, cancer is the result of many, many mutations, multi-hit model. And these include inherited mutations. I didn't talk about childhood cancers because it makes me sad. But what that is if a child inherits many mutations from their parents, then they require fewer additional accumulated mutations, fewer hits to develop cancer. Okay, following this video, you should be done now. Make sure you write your annotated bibliography entries. I will grade them soon. I'll find time. Do the Lecture 6 quiz. Post to the discussion. and do the assignment, which for this week is about the cell cycle and cancer. And it's October now. Get outside before it gets too cold, but wear sunscreen, maybe a hat. Have a good week.